Charles Starkweather, a teenage killer with James Dean looks.
He was a real tough, dangerous guy.
A rebel without a cause that spread terror in a community.
Anyone who had a gun got the gun out and loaded it.
National Guard wandering all over Lincoln expecting that he would show up someplace.
With his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Fugate, he went on a murderous road trip through 1950s Middle America. But were these young killers the twisted products of their environment, or were they born to kill?
Well, it was a small town then. There were still downtown cornfields behind houses, very sleepy, people waiting for something to happen, a little bit of a feeling that you were never going to get out of the town.
Lincoln in the mid-1950s was, it was basically a well-policed, pretty calm town without much major crime. People left their doors unlocked. Not like a lot of large cities, even in those days.
It was into this agricultural, God-fearing and law-abiding society that the red-haired, bow-legged Charles Starkweather was born in 1938, the third of 7 boys and 1 girl.
It isn't a politically correct term, but I'd call them poor white trash. They were certainly not the pillars of society. Mrs. Starkweather, his mother, was a very nice, hardworking woman that basically supported the family. Guy Starkweather worked off and on, but she was sort of the one that kept the family going, I think, and they had a bunch of kids. As far as I know, none of the other children ever got in any trouble. Working class is probably the best way to put it.
Charlie Starkweather would remember his early years as idyllic, playing cowboys with his brothers, fishing with his father, and helping Mum in the kitchen.
The family was poor, but they were not deprived. I mean, he ate, he had clothes.
There was nothing to indicate that his childhood was anything out of the ordinary until he went to school.
There was a huge change in him when he had his first day at school. He was teased terribly. He was bow-legged, and he was considered to be a slow learner, a dummy. And so school was horrendously traumatic in the context of such a big change for him.
Whereas he was kind of a meek kid, not a violent kid, when he was quite little, he began to evolve into a bully who would beat up on the kids, even if they were bigger than he, to try to cut them down to size if they were messing with him.
Dennis Carnop, now a lawyer, was the son of Lincoln's sheriff. He remembers the young Starkweather well.
He lived right across the street from me. They lived in a building just across the street from the county jail where we lived. The family was pretty rugged, pretty rugged. Charlie Starkweather was a PE assistant. He was a real tough, dangerous guy. I mean, he just looked dangerous, and you knew he was, and you just kind of were in constant fear of, what am I going to do something here, say something, do something where he's going to land on me as soon as the class is over. And when I say that, I'm not saying I was singled out for that. I think that's pretty much you know, what everybody felt about it. You were always glad when that was over and you could get out of there.
Many young people adopt a persona of being bad as a way of establishing some kind of role for themselves in their family, in the community more widely. Starkweather took that to a very different level.
He also showed a characteristic of so many serial murderers in being able to mimic someone that he thought he should be, and that was James Dean.
It was the time when there was the big, for the kids, which is what I remember, there was a big influence of James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause. I think there was a lot of anger, suppressed anger in the kids. It was just that feeling that there was nowhere to go. And what were you going to do? And how would you get out?
On leaving school, Starkweather got a job as a garbage man. It was then he met 13-year-old Carol Ann Fugate. Bob Hall attended Fugate's school.
Well, everybody knew who she was. She was a grade ahead of me. She was a very, very typical junior high girl. She liked boys. I don't think she liked school a lot. I do know that she had said to the art teacher, Miss Ralston, that when she'd been disciplined one day, "You old bat, someday I'm going to kill you." But then I think that wasn't that uncommon. It wasn't, you know, kids were blowing up at teachers. There was just a lot of this underlying tension right around then so it could have been anybody else having said that. It wasn't particular to Carol.
To the disappointment of Fugate's family, Carol and Charlie became inseparable.
She's the first girl that ever paid much attention to him, in a serious way anyway, because she was, I guess, 13 when they met. He was 18 when they met. And like a lot of young girls, I guess even today, she was impressed that an older guy was paying attention to her, and he was just tickled to death that this attractive young girl was paying attention to him.
She was supposedly taken by his bad boy persona. How many women do we know who like the bad boy, who like, you know, being kind of around somebody who's living on the edge? Because it's exciting to them. I mean, if you're living in the flatlands of nothing around you and somebody comes to you and says, "Let me show you the world," in a way that you couldn't even dream of course, if you don't have your own solid identity, you're going to say, why not?
But the few thrills that 1950s Lincoln provided were not enough for Starkweather.
He had ambitions. His family was very poor, but when he took his job as a trash collector, and it was exposed to neighborhoods outside of where he had grown, the middle class and upper middle class must have seen as if they were millionaires. He knew he could never attain that. So what do? You become an outlaw.
In late November 1957, Starkweather visited the Crest service station near Fugate's home, hoping to buy her a Christmas gift. The young attendant, Robert Colbert, was new.
Charlie wanted to buy a little toy, you know, for Carol, but he had no money. And he said, well, maybe you can let me buy it on time, but the fellow wouldn't let him do that. And so Charlie just grew furious.
In the early hours of December the 1st, 1957, Starkweather began casing the gas station. After visiting the store twice on the pretext of buying cigarettes and gum, he pulled up on the highway, covered his face with a bandana, and held up the lone attendant with a shotgun. It was Robert Colbert, 21 years old, with a young pregnant wife at home.
He wanted to get all the proceeds, you know, that there were in it's like the safe or whatever, but they couldn't open the safe, so he just had to content himself with the $100 that there were in the open till.
Starkweather forced Colvert into the driver's seat of his car.
He took the service station attendant, Bobby Colvert, out on this rural road, shot him in the head with a shotgun, killed him.
Just blew him away.
Many people commit a murder as a one-off, as a byproduct of being angry or seeking revenge, or because of the force of particular circumstances at a particular point in their life. But crucially, the vast majority of murderers stop after committing the first murder. But for that small number of people, of whom Charles Starkweather was one, rather than being overwhelmed by the experience, they found it exciting, they found it sexy, they found that it gave them a power and control over another person, a power and control that they felt had been denied to them in other aspects of their lives.
Charles Starkweather had taken his first life. It was not to be his last. December 1957. Charles Starkweather had robbed the Crest service station in Lincoln, Nebraska, then taken the attendant Robert Colvert to a deserted road and executed him.
He shot him in the head with a shotgun, killed him.
Just blew him away.
Starkweather disposed of the murder weapon in the river and altered the appearance of his car to avoid detection, while police searched vainly for the mystery killer. Reporter Del Harding was following the case closely.
Charlie was never suspected or interviewed. There were a bunch of people that were given lie detector tests, a bunch of others that were interviewed, but for some reason he slipped under the radar. And I don't know why, but he did.
For almost 2 months, Starkweather stayed out of trouble, enjoying his $100 haul with his now 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Fugate. But then, he struck again. And this time it would make the gas station robbery look like child's play.
I was a sophomore in high school when my mother picked me up after basketball practice and said there had been 3 murders, and they were pretty sure it was Charlie Starkweather.
On January the 21st, 1958, Starkweather had entered Carol Fugate's home, where she lived with her mother, Velda Bartlett, her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, and her 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean. After an argument broke out, Starkweather shot Marion Bartlett in the head.
After he killed Mr. Bartlett, then Mrs. Bartlett was screaming and the baby sister was screaming, and that's when he killed them.
Fugate's mother, Velda, was shot in the face. Her half-sister, Betty Jean, had a knife thrown into her throat and was beaten with the butt of a rifle. Her stepfather, Marion, was shot in the head and stabbed repeatedly in the throat.
I think he got in an argument over Carol with Mr. Bartlett, and I think it just escalated from there. But I don't think he went there with a premeditated idea of, I'm going to wipe him out.
Velda Bartlett's body was wrapped in bedding, carried to the outhouse and stuffed down the toilet opening. 2-year-old Betty Jean's body was put in a cardboard box and placed on the toilet seat. And Marion Bartlett was dumped in the chicken coop.
Mr. and Mrs. Bartlett and Betty Jean, the little 2.5-year-old half-sister, were killed on January 21st, 1958. Carol and Charlie stayed in the house until January 27th.
For 6 days, Starkweather and Fugate lived in the house as man and wife, while the bodies of Fugate's family lay just yards away.
The bodies were meaningless to them. The bodies were as meaningless as the chair or the sofa or the table or the lamp. They had no emotional meaning. So living with the bodies to us is a horrific thought, but to the serial killer, it's just another piece of thing.
Carol later claimed she wasn't at the house when the murders had occurred, and that Starkweather had told her that her family were held hostage elsewhere. However, Starkweather claimed Carol had played an active role, particularly in the beating of her half-sister.
With a number of serial killers, we see the killer operating within what's known as, by psychologists as a folie à deux, literally a madness shared by two. What it does, and most immediately, is it creates a loyalty between the two protagonists, whereby they normalize their behavior to each other. Their worldview becomes one which is permissible and acceptable, and everybody else's worldview becomes something that should be destroyed.
During their week in the Bartlett house, visitors were turned away by Carol with the excuse that the family were all ill. So was she Starkweather's captive or accomplice?
I find it very difficult to believe that Carol wasn't aware of what happened and his associate in crime. I don't think she was held hostage.
If she had been held prisoner, there had to be a way, if she had a grain of brain, that she could have gotten away. I mean, this is her town. She knew these people. She knew how to get out. Was it Carol who precipitated the murders? That's something that I don't think people have considered, that she may have been the moving force behind the murder of her family, because she was, in a way, estranged from them because of him.
After 6 days of being turned away, friends and relatives had grown increasingly suspicious.
One of the relatives, maybe her grandmother, came to the house and was refused admittance and indicated that she was going to get the police because she wanted to get in that house. And I think they figured out, oops, the police may be coming this time and causing some problems, and maybe we better get out of here.
Starkweather and Fugate packed clothes, got in his car, and left town.
The bodies were discovered on a Monday evening, and the Bartlett murders made the 10 o'clock TV news that night.
3 murders was a pretty big deal in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. Her mother and her 3-year-old half-sister, I mean, that's pretty shocking.
The people of Lincoln were stunned, but no one thought the triple murder was anything more than a one-off.
All serial killers are on a journey of discovery, and that journey is not just a journey in space and time, but also a journey to discover the kinds of person that they want to be.
On the 27th of January 1958, Starkweather and Fugate arrived at the farm of 70-year-old bachelor August Meyer, a place Starkweather knew well.
He and his dad had hunted with Mr. Meyer for several years, been friendly and everything.
Approaching the property, Starkweather's car got stuck in the muddy lane. Cold and angry, he and Carol continued to the farmhouse on foot.
His story was that Mr. Meyer showed up at the door with a gun, which I frankly doubt. Charlie shot him with a shotgun, and And this, was a family friend. He just killed him.
Meyer was shot in the back of the head at almost point-blank range.
Dragged the body out to a shed behind the house, and then he and Carol went in the house.
Starkweather searched the farmhouse for money, clothes and weapons, and ate cookies and jello, while August Meyer's dead body lay in the nearby wash house.
Once they've created this parallel world in which they've socialized each other to simply think of the kinds of behavior that they're engaging in as being normal, once they inhabit that world, it's much more easy for them to continue to behave according to the norms of that world, in which that world has to revolve around Charles Starkweather and Carol Fugate. And so it's much more easy for them, after they've murdered once, twice, 3 times, to continue to murder until they're stopped.
As darkness fell, Starkweather and Fugate began to get restless.
That night, they decided to leave, and Charlie's car was stuck in the mud in the lane leading up to the farmhouse. And so they took off on foot, and that's when they were walking down the nearby county road, and the teenagers from Bennett, Bobby Jensen, who was 17, and Carol King, his girlfriend, who was 16, being good Samaritans, stopped and offered them a ride.
What was to happen next would shake the community to its core. Nebraska, January 1958. Teenage killer Charles Starkweather's body count stands at 5. A gas station attendant. The mother, stepfather and half-sister of his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Fugate. And now, 70-year-old farmer, August Meyer. After dumping Meyer's body in his wash house, Starkweather and Fugate began to leave the area on foot. They were then offered a ride by young fiancés Robert Jensen and Carol King. At gunpoint, the popular local teenagers were forced to an abandoned storm cellar where a schoolhouse had once stood.
They were really, truly all-American kids. I mean, everybody loved them. They were both just really good, nice kids.
The next day, August Meyer's body was found at his farm. Reporter Del Harding was at that crime scene when Robert Jensen and Carol King's fate was discovered.
We were over at the Meyer farm, and we all rushed over to the storm cellar, and they opened the door to the storm cellar, and I was looking down and seeing those kids in that storm cellar, and it was just a very horrible scene. I can close my eyes and still see it today. I mean, it was bad enough seeing August Meyer with, in the shed. He'd been shot with a shotgun, blood all over him, but somehow it just seemed much worse seeing those teenagers.
They were like 16 years old. There was stabbing, there was mutilation, there was sexual assault, it's pretty gruesome stuff,
Starkweather later denied the stabbing of Carol King. Newspaperman Del Harding was among many who believed him.
The sexual mutilation, I'm personally convinced, was done by Carol Fugate.
It's not unusual in a partnership serial killing. The man is the one who starts the first homicide, but he has a tremendous power over his female partner. She is not an unwilling partner. She's not what we call the Stockholm syndrome, where you're captured and you have to take on the identity of your captor in order to survive. That's not it at all. But they develop some type of an unusual bond where she will essentially do whatever he tells her to do and will participate in the actual crimes.
Using Jensen's car, Starkweather and Fugate set off west with a plan to escape to Washington State, where Starkweather had a brother. But after 3 hours on the road, they changed their minds, turned around, and headed back to Lincoln. What would happen next would send shockwaves through the city, the state, and ultimately the whole country.
I was in, I can't remember which class, but I was in school. And what we heard was a strange announcement that we were all to go home. When we left the school, it was rather amazing. Again, you got to remember this kind of sleepy town, and here's this sea of cars outside the playground, of a traffic jam of cars waiting to pick up their kids. We had no idea what had happened. The school announcement, made no reference to what was going on. I think more of us thought that something had happened with the Russians. I think we were all afraid that there'd been an invasion or World War III had started. And in a way, for Lincoln, maybe it had.
Around 8:30 a.m. on the 28th of January 1958, Starkweather and Fugate had entered a mansion in the wealthy country club district of Lincoln. They held the occupants Clara Ward and her deaf maid Lillian Fenkel captive at gunpoint. At around 6 p.m., Clara Ward's husband, the 47-year-old industrialist C. Lower Ward, returned home from work. The next morning, when he failed to turn up at the office, suspicions were raised. Lower Ward's body was discovered just inside the front door. He had been shot in the back and through the temple. Clara Ward was on the bedroom floor, dead from multiple stab wounds to neck, chest, and back. Lillian Fenkel was dead, tied to a bed. She'd been stabbed repeatedly in the chest and stomach and had severe cuts to her hands, arms, and legs.
The murders were horrendously brutal. As with most serial murders, it's not just one thing. It can be cutting, it can be stabbing. It is not just a one-on-one, okay, I'm shooting you, you're dead. There's a tremendous amount of brutality.
After the murder of Fugate's family, everyone in Lincoln had assumed the killers had left town for good. As reports of the new deaths spread, so did the terror.
There was real panic in the streets. People were running to school to get their kids out of school. Men were patrolling the streets with shotguns. They thought, oh my God, they're back in Lincoln. Nobody really knew where they were. And I think the mayor was quoted to something to the effect that we're really got a sick situation. We don't know how many more bodies we might find around town.
Anyone who had a gun got the gun out and loaded it and was prepared for anything unusual. And if you had an extra gun, you gave it to a neighbor who didn't have one.
We saw people wandering around armed, National Guard, wandering all over Lincoln, expecting that he would show up someplace.
The Wards were prominent business people, lived in the nicest area in town, lovely house, had a maid, etc. So it's almost random. Nobody felt safe anywhere. Nowhere was safe.
so often the victims of serial killers are those people who are on the margins of our society. We're talking about people who are excluded because of their sexuality, because of the fact that they're selling sexual services, or because they're, for example, homeless. In terms of Starkweather and Fugate's victims, often we are talking about significantly wealthier victims, and that's very unusual in the phenomenon of serial murder.
With panic on the streets, law enforcement mounted a massive manhunt for the teenage killers.
People were scared, and I remember my dad and his deputies were, they were just going, they were hunting all over. They had roadblocks. They put out a call for they had a mounted sheriff's posse because they were trying to man all the roads in and out of town.
But Starkweather and Fugate were already gone. They'd stolen the Ward family's black Packard and were once again heading west, aiming to hide out in Washington state. And their reign of terror was far from over. Late January 1957, 10 men, women and children had been killed in and around Lincoln, Nebraska. 19-year-old James Dean wannabe Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend Carol Fugate had eluded capture and were heading west in search of freedom.
It was all part of a plan, to live happily ever after as arch criminals who were able to escape justice. It seems so absurd to us to imagine a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old living happily ever after what they did. But the adolescent mind is a brain that is not fully myelinated in the frontal lobes. So you're not dealing with people that you should measure on the same scale you would measure an adult. These are children, adolescents, with very poor ability to think ahead.
He was somebody who was caught up in the celebrity of cowboys and Indians, of James Dean, of the rebellious teenager, the rebellious outsider who was going to fight the world as he saw it. He also found himself Bonnie to his Clyde.
He found an identity that he moved into. Wasn't a true identity, but he acted out as if he were in a movie.
The next day, the teenagers crossed the state line into Wyoming, land of the old-style cowboys that Starkweather had loved so much as a child. But passing through the small town of Douglas, they began to feel conspicuous. The Ward family's large Packard was eye-catching, and its Nebraska plates were a giveaway. Starkweather decided they needed another car.
He decided to switch cars and saw a car on the side of the road near Douglas, Wyoming. There was a salesman sleeping in the car who he shot.
37-year-old traveling salesman Merle Collison was shot 9 times as he sat in his car.
And then he can't get the emergency brake off. And someone comes up to him and said, do you need some help? And he points a gun at him and says, if you don't release this emergency brake, I'm going to kill you.
But the Good Samaritan, 29-year-old geologist Joe Sprinkle, fought back.
He was a big husky guy who wrestled with Starkweather and got the gun away from him, or he would have been another victim also.
As Starkweather was disarmed, a Wyoming deputy arrived on the scene.
Carol allegedly ran back and said to the deputy, "Save me, I've been held hostage by Charles Starkweather."
Meanwhile, Starkweather took off in the Ward family's Packard and was pursued at speed through the Wyoming countryside, while officers fired on him from their moving vehicle.
It was like the Old West. They were shooting at him from behind, and one of the bullets went through the back of the car and pierced his ear. At that time, Starkweather came to an immediate halt, and at that time, law enforcement arrested him without him causing any kind of a fuss.
A total of 11 people had died, 10 of them in the space of 8 days. Now Starkweather was finally in custody. Despite Carroll's claims of being an unwilling hostage, they were both charged with first-degree murder. The townsfolk and teenagers of Lincoln flocked to get a glimpse of the now notorious young couple. Sheriff's son, Dennis Carnop, had a bird's-eye view of the commotion his former schoolmate had caused.
I remember that the trial, of course, was held in the courthouse, which was, 50 feet from the jail where we lived, and that the crowds were tremendous crowds, and that feelings were running very high about this. And I remember they had posted armed guards on the top of the jail and other key places, and I know that was primarily for a show of force so that the crowd would stay.
Despite a death toll of 11, Starkweather insisted he'd killed in self-defense.
For me, there are two things going on there. Firstly, it's what criminologists would call a technique of neutralization. In other words, he's finding some way of justifying or minimizing the gravity of his behavior. But it also goes back, I think, to that sense of the fantasy life that Starkweather inhabited, whereby it's almost as if it's a perverse moral code. It's something that he's seen at the cowboy films, something he's read in a comic book. It's a way of justifying his behavior. It's a way, frankly, of justifying the unjustifiable.
Starkweather's guilt was not in doubt, but after initially claiming Fugate was wholly innocent, he almost immediately backtracked.
His initial story, they had, I'm sure, cooked up was that, gee, she didn't have any part in it. And that didn't last long, and he started saying, okay, here's the real story. And then he gave statements implicating her, took lie detector tests, which, of course, were not admissible in court, but verified his version of the events. The vast majority of the reporters that covered the trial, we all felt that she was clearly guilty.
Dennis Carnop's mother was the matron that accompanied Fugate from the capture onwards.
Any of the time that she had Carroll never made any claim to be a victim, to be a hostage, to have no knowledge of it. It was only when they were talking to some greater audience that she told those stories. And she never told my mother that at all, which obviously affected my mother's thinking about the whole thing. What I remember my mother saying about it is that she was the brains of the outfit.
After a 2-month trial, the jury found Starkweather and Fugate to be guilty of first-degree murder. Starkweather was sentenced to death. 15-year-old Fugate to life imprisonment.
Her demeanor was very unemotional, very no expression on her face throughout the trial. The only time I ever saw a display of emotion was when she was found guilty, and she broke down and cried when the jury verdict came in.
In the space of less than 2 months, 11 innocent people had died in a killing spree that sent shockwaves around the United States. But were Starkweather and Fugate born killers? or were they a twisted product of the environment in which they grew up?
You have to remember that they're adolescents, 19 and 14. We're all adolescents at one time, and we've all felt at times like killing the teacher, mom, who belted us, dad who wouldn't give us a bigger allowance, the brother that stole our toys, whatever. We've all had murderous fantasies, but we don't do any of those things because we're socialized enough to have internal guilt mechanism, braking mechanism that makes us think about, well, we'd like to do that, but it would be absolutely wrong. We would be shunned, we would have a miserable life, so we're not going to do it. This brake mechanism just ain't working in some of these people like Charlie and Carol.
Until they had been stopped, they would have kept going. There was nothing behind, they had no remorse, they had no reason to kill. So were they both born to kill? He seemed to have been. Something triggered him in his adolescent years where he took on this persona that was trying to fill in this hollowness inside him. And she just went along as a passive, participating member.
I think what happens in relation to Starkweather is that we've got two different processes happening that propels him onto a trajectory where other people will end up dead. Firstly, he meets a partner with whom he can form a folie à deux, literally a madness shared by two. And that madness allows him to normalize a world in which his violence will be permissible, his violence will be acceptable, his violence will be desirable. And the second thing is, unfortunately, some people who, after they murder the first time, aren't overwhelmed by that experience and want to never repeat it. A small number of murderers want to continue to behave like that because they found that experience visceral, vital, exciting, sexy. They found that experience gave them a sense of self that was missing from other parts of their lives.